Hey everyone, my name is Ryan and I am a Bible nerd. Recently, in my men's Bible study group, I had an opportunity to speak, and we've been going through the book of Romans. So I want to just kind of do something different to not add to that because the teacher was going to kind of take over when he got back. But it was just kind of a fun opportunity to be able to teach on something totally different for this men's Bible study group. And I've been able to speak a couple times. It's been really fun to kind of work on these presentations and kind of hone some skills. And I really enjoy this type of stuff. I love teaching. I love just nerding out on the Bible and nerding out on Christian topics. And so today on the podcast and on the video here on my YouTube channel. So if you are on the podcast, you can jump over to Bible Nerd, and nerd is with a three instead of an E. It's kind of a fun way to just say Bible Nerd. So Bible, Bible, and then N3RD. That's where you'll find my website, Facebook, YouTube, my YouTube channel, and then the podcast as well. So love to have you enjoy this content. I'm having a lot of fun creating it, learning a whole bunch of new skills on lighting and cameras and Canva and all this stuff I never thought I'd ever do. And it's been kind of fun, kind of stretching myself to learn how to do these types of things. So today I want to go through this presentation I put together on the Dead Sea Scrolls. I think it's one of the most incredible finds, if not the, outside of one other thing that's been recently discovered or fairly recently that we'll talk about at the end of this presentation. But I think the Dead Sea Scrolls are incredible. And I want to kind of hit some highlights as part of this presentation and hopefully get you excited enough to start doing your own research on what these even are and why they are so important. So let's go ahead and slide through some of these slides and see if you get something out of this. I love your comments, subscribe, uh, share, whatever, all that fun stuff. Just love to have you engage in some of this content. So here we go. So the Dead Sea Scrolls. This was a great infographic that I found on wesleyhuff.com. He's got a bunch of different infographics, but I thought this one was really useful for my presentation because it gave a couple of big summaries of the Dead Sea Scroll. A couple things I want to point out is that 75% of what they found so far, roughly 75%, is in Hebrew, which is amazing because it really pushes back some of the earliest records that we have in Hebrew outside, and I mean by like 1,000 years in some cases. So it really is pretty amazing to be able to kind of time capsule some of these documents that far back or that much closer to when they were originally written. The other thing is the sheer volume of what they've been able to find. Out of over 10,000 copies or fragments or different pieces, they've been able to put together over 970 scrolls, which is incredible. They have at the time of this recording, which could change as they're continuing to discover caves and finding new pieces and putting some of this stuff together. They have 33 copies of Deuteronomy, 24 copies of Genesis. I saw one report that's over 30 now copies of the Psalms. We have 20 copies of Isaiah, including the Dead Sea Scrolls. One of the biggest finds, probably what you hear about the most, is the Great Isaiah Scroll, a complete copy of Isaiah, which is absolutely amazing because up to that point, they only had fragments or way later versions of it. So to have a complete copy, I mean, it's like 98%. There's a few chunks that are missing, and I'll show you a picture of it here in a moment. But that thing is absolutely amazing. Also, you see on this projection kind of where these caves are, kind of the hot spots. We'll talk about that a little bit further. But it's just an amazing find to be able to find that many, that intact, that farther back than what we had at that particular point. And I just think it makes it one of the greater finds. Is it really is truly a time capsule? The Dead Sea Scrolls were found around 1946, and then they weren't really released. They weren't really even cared about all that much until in the 1990s because they were still kind of figuring out what do they have here. And there's even a record, and you can dig into a little bit further of a museum or professors didn't really care all that much, and as they started finding more and realizing what they had outside of Jerusalem here at this particular location, it really started to bring a lot more scholars involved, and they started researching it more and more. And to find this great Isaiah scroll is just amazing. It's absolutely amazing. So here's a picture of it. And again, if you're on the podcast, sorry about that, but you can go to my YouTube channel at BibleNerd.com and watch the full video. But here's an image of this great Isaiah scroll, and you can see how intact it is. There are some chunks there, and you can see that top row, the little bottom half. There are some chunks of that are missing. There's a great display of the Great Isaiah Scroll at at the Bible of the Museum in Washington D.C. And I have a potential trip planned to where I'm going to be able to go back to the museum on my way to Jerusalem. So I'm trying to work out a trip to the Holy Land this spring, late spring, early summer. And one of the things I'm trying to do is kind of team it up to be able to have the flight, just go to DC, maybe spend a day or two there. I've never been there before. So I'm really trying to put that out there for some financing and for some other things that I'm trying to do to make this trip happen on my way to Jerusalem. I can't think of a funner trip than to, on the way to Jerusalem, stop at the Bible and Museum in Washington D.C. And I've never been to D.C., so I think it'd be really, really a cool thing to experience. But just an amazing find. Now, I believe the Great Isaiah Scroll is actually stored now in Jerusalem. It's stored in a very climate controlled in the basement of a museum, very well protected, and just it's very fragile, of course. And so they're really trying to keep this thing intact because it is just an amazing find. And what makes it so amazing as well is how accurate it is and how amazing the translation effort of the Masoretics and Septuagint, those types of things, to these original writings. Now, this is in Hebrew, where the Septuagint is in Greek, but it gives you a chance to see after if something's in the ground for 1,000 years of all the schisms and councils and popes and kings and all this stuff couldn't affect that thing. It's been in the dirt for those 1,000 years before the writings, and even longer, all the way to 1946. So it really gives you a sense of how accurate is it. And it's amazingly accurate. Is there some differences? Sure. In fact, there's even notes that the Masoretic was going to a previous version of a Hebrew word where even the Great Isaiah Scroll, with where it was written, is even using more modern to that time some of the phrasing in their translation. But is it dramatically off? No. You would think that if the scribes were corrupt in the Middle Ages or later on, that they were influenced by a king or a pope or a council or a theology, it would work its way into those translations. And it's amazing how that narrative falls short with this find and why it is such an instrumental find and gives you such a respect for those people that were dedicating all the time to make sure it was right. There's such an emphasis and such an importance on transcribing it correctly. Now, is there going to be errors? There's going to be things. Yes, there's still human nature involved. But I think we in our Western world, we're susceptible to this idea of elephant phone, where as soon as it passes from one to the next to the next to the next, then it just by the time it gets all the way to the end, it's not the original. But it's amazing when the effort to get it right is the key part and the phrasing of it and having other scribes check your work. It's not like it's just up to one person. They'd have multiple people translate it, like page to page, and compare and see what the differences are. And they really put a lot of effort. This wasn't just a game. This was their culture, their blood, their tribe. There's so much more emphasis to get it right and divinely inspired to make sure you don't go to the right or the left. That you really were making sure that this was done correctly. And this validates a lot of that effort, which again makes it such an amazing find. So let's talk a little bit about the Isaiah scroll timeline of when Isaiah was kind of put together. So here's a chart that kind of gives you a couple key points we're going to hit on. Now, there's going to be some other events that happened during this timeline, but I want to give you kind of an idea where Isaiah even came from. We first have the dual monarchies. So after King Solomon passes away in 931 BC, there is kind of a northern and southern kingdom split. There's kind of a split between the northern and southern kingdoms. And what happens during that time is you see the kings kind of rise and fall. We have the First Chronicles, Second Chronicles. We have First and Second Kings that is going through this time frame of these different kings. And if you notice the way the writers of those books don't ever give any good news from the northern kingdom. They're just kings worse than the one before, wasn't following God. And even the southern kingdom doesn't do that great of a job. At least there's a few kings that seem to try to turn back towards Yahweh. But what's happening is as the dual monarchy period is coming about, there is a split that happens during the Assyrian exile. So the Assyrians attack the northern kingdoms, and you see a exile where they get scattered amongst their kingdom, but also some refugees return to the southern kingdom at this point. And you start to see writings that are starting to come about this time to react to what's happening. Prophets are showing up. You're starting to get a lot more of this idea that this exile is coming because God is allowing it to happen because the people have strayed so far away. In fact, he's using them as an instrument of their cleansing, if you will, or getting them back to a good standing. You see during Josiah's reign that there's even a revival, if you will, where they discover a Deuteronomy scroll. find out how far off they've gotten with pagan worship, even at the temple. And there really is a revival to get everybody back to a good standing with Yahweh, with their God. But it's a little too late. And what happens after that is the big bad Babylonians show up in 856 and not only destroy the southern kingdom, but also destroy the temple. And this is where you'll see that first temple period. And the reason why that's so important is the writings and the things that are happening during that time are really influenced by what's happening during these exile periods, especially the Babylonians. In fact, the Babylonian Empire becomes kind of an archetype of all the evil world empires. Even Rome is known as kind of the next Babylon, is way they look at the events that led to these exiles and how it's such a crucial part of getting their stories actually start to getting written down. So you see a lot of writings start to increase, or the effort to maintain, collect, start to put together what we'll eventually call the Old Testament, the Hebrew scriptures. So much of it is starting during these periods. And then, of course, you've got the Persian rule after the Babylonian exile where they're allowed to return. This is where the temple gets rebuilt. You have a ton more writings, or at least an effort to put them together and collect them into stories like Judges and some of these other things, the Psalms, all start really getting collected during this exile return under the Persian Empire. And then eventually you're going to have the Greek rule. You're going to have a short period where they gain some independence before the Romans show up. But a lot of that, and that becomes kind of the second temple period is what it's known about. So Isaiah is really during a lot of this time frame. Isaiah himself was alive during that first Assyrian Empire collapse, and he was foretelling and prophesying that these events were going to start to happen, which is really where you get chapters 1 through 39. It's what's really known as closest to the writings of actual Isaiah. And then the next chapters, you get a better breakdown of the other periods that are part of these exile periods. So the book of Isaiah is not all Isaiah. It's actually going to be broken into 3 sections in what most scribes and most scholars believe happened during that time. And so you start seeing all this fulfillment of prophecy, and what they start to label is what he was saying, and then the next wave of how they interpret what was happening with the Babylonian Empire. And that's where you have verses or chapters 40 through 55 really shifts the focus on this liberation of Israel from the Babylonian captivity, framing it as another Exodus type story. I mean, there's probably not another event within the Jewish culture up to that time, especially, that had more of a meaning. I mean, the Exodus story is crucial with the Ten Commandments, with the Passover festivals. I mean, there's so many things that are, and so many remembrances that go back to Torah, back to the Exodus story. And I would say the Babylonian Empire, their exile, the fact that their temple gets destroyed, really is singed into their belief system, and the fact of how far away they had fallen, that their God had literally left the temple. Yahweh had literally left in prophecies and things like that, and that how this was supposed to be a way to return. Then chapters 56 to 66 address the issues about this post-exile period. And you really see the focus of the theme shift to the temple, Sabbath observance. This concept of salvation is really deep through 55, or chapters 56 through 66. But you really get a feeling as you read Isaiah, there really is kind of these 3 sections that are different times of the history of Israel. And I think it's important to know, many people don't realize that there's kind of 3 different writers or 3 different sets of writers that happen to do with Isaiah, and why it's such an important scroll. I mean, it is encapsulating a huge part of the Israelite culture, and why finding that scroll is absolutely amazing, especially all intact to what we see today. So then, the book of Isaiah invites readers to reflect on themes of judgment, of hope, and of restoration. I think that's really what you see in Isaiah, and it's just an absolute beautiful work. But knowing kind of the time frame of why it was written, when it was written, who wrote it, I think just gives you a fuller understanding of why it is such an important find and why it's still such an important book on the Old Testament scriptures. All right. So let's talk a little bit about the origins of Qumran. So Qumran is where the Dead Sea Scrolls were found, and it's most likely a sect called the Essenes. So about 135 BCE, a community of devout and educated Jews moved into this abandoned area that was likely a 7th century settlement that might have been known as the city of Salt or Shechem, that is mentioned in the book of Joshua, chapter 15, verses 61 and 62. So they believe there might be a connection between that. And you can see that Greek influence was really starting to pop up around the area during this time. And groups were starting to be formed known as the Sadducees, the Pharisees. You had the Zealots, or what they Romans would call the dagger men, the really, really zealous to the point where they were trying to cause all kinds of revolts. And then you have the Essenes. Now, there's other groups, Hasmoneans, Maccabees. I mean, there's a lot of things that are going on during this time frame, but there's really these big groups that were starting to be formed. And the Essenes are most likely the ones that settled this Qumran area. And what they did is they wanted to be away from maybe the main city centers. They weren't kind of in line with what was happening with the Sadducees that were really trying to line themselves up with the Roman Empire. And during the Hasmonean Empire, they were kind of lost their priestly positions because the Hasmoneans kind of came in and removed them of their high priest and kind of made the king and the high priest the same thing. So they kind of felt like there's a lot of tension that was happening with them. So they kind of moved out of the city centers because they lived a lot more of a monk type style of life. And so they didn't mind being more isolated and away from the Roman influence, the Sadducees, the Greeks. They really were trying to stay away from that. They weren't as open to the Roman occupation as maybe even the Sadducees were, or that Greek influence that was happening. And they really did follow a very strict sense of following the law of Moses, other than maybe the temple worship. They felt that maybe that had drifted too far away, especially under the second temple period, that it still was corrupt. And they just didn't feel like it was actually what was originally intended for temple worship. But as far as everything else, they were very strict on following the law of Moses, very strict on Sabbath and purity rituals. And so during about 68 AD, there was a big revolt that was happening against the Jewish and what's known as kind of the Jewish Russian or Russian, the Jewish Roman War from 66 to about 73 CE. And about 68 is where you see these scrolls are starting to be hidden in Qumran as the Roman Empire is coming down to kind of squash this rebellion. And they just had a little bit too much with what was going on. They were always just a tinderbox, just ready to go off at any moment. I mean, there was festivals of Hanukkah that were happening that would just always rile up everybody. Passover would come around. It was always a lot of turmoil. And it finally hit a tipping point in about 66 AD that eventually led to the destruction of the Second Temple in 70 AD. And this conflict ended around 73. But there was a second revolt that happened around 132 to 135 AD that was way bloodier, way worse, other than the destruction of the temple. That's where you even see some more scrolls start to be hidden again around the caves and around these areas. And that's where you start seeing other finds that they've been able to find recently that are really, really fascinating within that area. But I want to give you a little idea where the Essenes, kind of the idea of these people, they were very devout, very monk-like. Their translations were very, very strict. They really had a sense of making sure their things were written down. And it isn't all in the Dead Sea Scrolls. It isn't all Old Testament or Hebrew scriptures. There was community laws, there was commentaries, there was other non-canonical books that were there that was passing around and stories. So I mean, there's a lot of stuff that was there, but actually finding some of the Hebrew scriptures I just think is incredibly fascinating. So here's a little map here that shows you some of the hot spots of where they found most of it. You can see on the north part of the map, that's where Qumran is. But as you work your way down the coastline, so to speak, of the Dead Sea, they started finding other caves. And it seems like these other caves may have been a little bit later, maybe that second revolt, because they start finding more in Greek. They start finding other things that they're in these caves. And what I wanted to highlight on this one presentation is what's known as cave number 8, which is also nicknamed the Cave of Horror, because in this particular cave, I believe it was, let me check my notes here, I believe it was 70 feet, maybe 80 feet below the edge of the cliff there, as you can see in the photo. And what they found is these Roman encampments up on the top. So people had kind of gone into this cave to kind of wait it out and hide. Romans knew they were there, found out that they were there, and just waited them out. And unfortunately, they died in that cave. So they find bones and adult and children that were there. This was found in about 1960s when this cave was found. And they kind of left it alone for a long time just to honor the people that were obviously rather stay in that cave than have to face whatever was going to happen if they went up to the Romans and ended up dying in this particular cave. And it really is pretty sad. And so for a long time, they didn't investigate this cave. Well, they were able to go back into it to find other scraps of parchment and just kind of investigate this cave a little bit further. And that's where they actually found Zechariah and Naaman scrolls, or pieces of scrolls. It's very small little fragments they found in this cave as they were able to go back into it and research it. But it's known as the Cave of Horrors because of the bones that they found in there, along with, most likely, the Romans were up on top waiting them out. They hid in this cave and ended up passing away in this cave. But this is really cool. And this is a photo you can find if you research Cave of Horror, Cave number 8, Dead Sea Scrolls, just finds like that. They found a basket, and here's a picture of it, that is most likely the oldest woven basket ever found. And it is, I mean, it predates anything else of this era, because most things get to a certain point where it starts changing to clay pots and things like that. So I actually found a woven basket this old and this big and this intact is absolutely fascinating outside of biblical stuff, because this predates even the people that passed away in the cave. This predates that by a long shot. So this cave is obviously used for other things as people were using caves to maintain food or that type of thing. So there probably was food in this basket. It was kind of stored and then buried to be able to kind of preserve it. And they actually found soil on the inside. I think they're going to get it tested. I didn't see what they found may have been in the basket, if they were able to figure out if it was fruit or whatever was in it. But it doesn't look like it was maintained for scrolls. I mean, it really predates that. So this is an incredible find outside of biblical scholarship or anything with Hebrew scriptures or the promised land or any of that type of stuff. Predates it by a long ways. They're really saying this could be the oldest basket ever found. That is just absolutely fascinating. So last, I want to end with this. This is known as the Megiddo Mosaic. This find is outside of the Dead Sea Scrolls, but I think between the Dead Sea Scrolls and this is some of the most incredible finds when it comes to biblical, especially in Christianity, when it comes to this. So you'll see this is a mosaic they found underneath a prison. So they had this prison in Israel that they were going to expand. And as they started to dig up their area to be able to expand this prison, they found this mosaic that was painstakingly preserved. Like, whoever tried to hide this from whatever Romans, whatever was happening during that time, they made a big effort to try to preserve this. Hopefully, maybe in the way they were hoping to be able to come back and maybe be able to bring it back up and continue to use it as maybe the earliest church for the Christians. So this mosaic floor is amazing, because most of the churches were inside of other houses and things like that, where this looks like it may have been specifically built for religious services. And what it really is unique about it, in a couple different things, it has the person who paid for it or commissioned this floor, this mosaic floor. It actually is a centurion that looks like he paid for this to be built, and it even has the artist's name on it, which is pretty rare. Even though the other mosaics don't usually have the artist named on there. I think there's, for my research, on maybe only 100 they've found so far, of all the ones that are out there, actually have the artist's name on it. There might be signed, there might be some sort of stamp, there might be something that people know, okay, that was we don't even know who that artist is, but at least we see that stamp or something about it, like a signature, if you will. This actually has his name, which is really, really rare. The other thing that makes it really cool is it says they worshiped Jesus as God. This pushes back the earliest time that the early Christians noticed or had this idea that Jesus was God. It pushes it back by a long ways. I mean, you have the Nicene creeds and that type of stuff that were forming in 325 that were kind of out there, but this pushes that back even further, closer and closer to the actual events, which I think is just incredible. This Trinitarian idea was not just a modern concept, if you will. It wasn't something just created by that council. It predates it to the point where they were building a mosaic floor in tribute to Jesus as God. So it really does push back. What did the early Christians think? Now, obviously, the Jewish people had an issue with it because they kept trying to kill Jesus for claiming to be more than just a man. And that's one of the things that has schismed and transformed the our church throughout the very beginning. I mean, that's the biggest thing that we wrestle with, is who is Jesus in relation to the Father and the Holy Spirit. I mean, that Trinitarian idea has caused denominations, schisms, different ways to interpret that, the relationship between the Son and the Father and the Holy Spirit, and is Jesus God in the flesh? I mean, there's all kinds of debate about that. I mean, that's probably the biggest reason that there's differences between denominations, or between Muslims and Christians and Jews and Christians. I mean, that it really is a fundamental difference. And it's fascinating to see we have an actual piece of archaeology that pushes the date back to when the earliest people of this following of this group were having those thoughts that Jesus was God. Also, I want to point out on this photo here is this idea of the fish. So you can see on this slide, it's got the kind of IX, kind of a zero Y, and kind of an E shape. That was the Greek word for fish. And what you saw is very early on, the Christians didn't use a cross as part of their stories. They use these fish because of that famous story of the fish and the bread and feeding the 5,000. That was a major fundamental story that was passed around. A lot of people were a part of it. So that was really how it kind of started. You even have these icons of a fish symbol that they would use to point to where the Christians were, or where their meeting house was going to be, or if you were followers, and kind of almost an underground railroad kind of thing where you could know, okay, the Christians are over there, they're over here. So the fish became kind of this symbol that they even would change the words of fish as another way of kind of underground railroad kind of thing of what that actually meant. Because there are a lot of places were these fish places. So fish were common. So it's kind of a hiding in plain sight kind of thing. This idea that this is where the Christians are. This is where they're meeting. There's those ones that are meeting. It's pretty interesting to see that fish was like Jesus Christ, God, Son, Savior. That's what those letters were kind of as a way to abbreviate basically the Christians and what they believed. Very, very, very early on. So to see the fish icons on this mosaic floor is incredible. It just pushes back again what the early followers of this movement thought they were following, and who they were following, and what the stories meant, even to them very early on, and how the development of Trinitarian concepts started to evolve and names started getting put to these concepts. So I think this find is absolutely incredible. In fact, at the Bible Museum, they have this mosaic floor that they brought over to the display. And I think they're going to be doing it through the end of July this year of 2025. And so another reason I'm really trying to get there, not only to be able to go to the museum, I just really want to, ever since it's been open, it's been kind of one of my bucket list things. And now to team it up with this trip to the Holy Land, I think is going to be incredible, especially while this is still there. And I think after July, it goes back to Jerusalem, back to where it was found, or they'll probably preserve it some way near where it was found, or something like that. I'm not sure. I don't know if I saw anything about that, but I think it's just these finds are just incredible. I love nerding out on this. I love talking about this stuff. If you want to engage, please comment, like, subscribe. Let me know what I got right, what I got wrong. We zip through that pretty quickly. And it's obviously a little a little different when you're doing it on like a video here than I'm doing in like a face-to-face with somebody. But I just love this stuff. Don't you guys just love this stuff? Isn't it great? And this find, along with Dead Sea Scrolls, to me really validates a few things that I've struggled with, or that the culture I was raised in kind of struggled with, is the idea that some of this stuff was corrupted, that we don't have originals, or that we have false or faked or corrupted, or I don't know why it's so easy in our culture to kind of fall for some of those narratives because of the elephant phone concept. You know, that idea that if a scroll went from this guy to this king to this pope to this Orthodox, whatever, Catholic, whatever, Protestant, whatever, kings and all this kind of stuff, that by the time I get this Bible, where is it? By the time I get this wonderful document or collection of documents, that somehow corrupt, that it's missing what the original authors intended. And the more that I've studied, the more I look at these finds, the more I look at the work it takes to get this into English and into my hand, the more reliable I have found it. And the more they're not trying to hide when there is a word or a phrase or something that's only used once in the entire Bible, and they're trying to figure out, okay, what does that mean? But there's so many technologies available. There's so many apps available where you can pair translation. You can see what they're trying to tell you, and they're not trying to hide it. I don't feel like there's this major conspiracy or corruption that they're trying to do some sort of false narrative. Now, there are some translations out there that really get a lot more interpretive. They get really kind of out there with what they're trying to get it into English. But if you look at some of these serious translations and you look at the differences and you look at the notes and you look at the footnotes and just kind of dig into it, I'm amazed at how accurate it is and how every language today, even modern language. I've been studying Italian for a while, and there's still words today that just don't translate into English all that well. Or they have 4 or 5 words for one thing, we got one. And yet they had a lot of different words. So trying to get it word for word sometimes wouldn't make sense. So sometimes you have to have a kind of thought for thought so you get the idea, the paraphrase, the metaphor they were trying to draw on. And there's so many things that are just hyperlinked to the culture that if you only do word for word, you're going to miss it. But if you get phrase for phrase or thought for thought, or what did it mean to an Israelite when they heard that phrase? Just like if I said, beam me up, Scotty, some of you might know what that means. There's a context with that, or the dog ate my homework. Well, that doesn't make a lot of sense if you're an Israelite or somebody on a different continent. So it's amazing how accurate this is. And I want you to know that if you think this is corrupt, now, whether you believe the events, that's a whole different story. That's where faith starts to kick in, interpretation. But as far as getting what they wrote into my hands in English, this is amazingly reliable, like divinely reliable. Then the work really comes into, do you believe what it even says? Do you believe the witnesses? Do you believe what it says? That's a whole different thing. That's where religion kicks in. That's where some faith kicks in. But as far as knowing that this is the Bible is accurate and true and written down correctly and translated correctly, I don't think there's any doubt. There's no doubt. Anyway, got on a little bit of a soapbox there, but I love this stuff. I think it's so cool. I love the opportunity to talk about it. I'm trying to get better at all this stuff, presenting. I'm getting more opportunities to speak at my church. I want more opportunities. I'm going to try to hone my skills here a little bit. But if you have an opportunity, if you need somebody to speak at one of your events, if you have a church gathering or something and need somebody to talk about Bible stuff, I'd love to talk to you about other presentations I put together. And obviously, it's a little different when it's on a podcast or a video. I mean, when I'm live in front of a crowd, it's going to be a little bit different presentation, but I just love doing this stuff. So if you need help with that, please reach out. If you want me to come to your church, talk about it, I'd love to have that opportunity to just expand on these concepts. I've got all kinds of different stuff I can show you. But anyway, we'll keep putting the content out. I love your feedback. Like, subscribe, comment, and we'll see you next time. Hope you have a wonderful day.